Welcome to the DeCypher Podcast. As you can see, DeCypher, an interdisciplinary journal of Asia, floating in the background. So, welcome. Thank you for writing for us. And we're going to be having a conversation on forest fires. And we're going to be having a conversation on ecology, environment, and economics, largely around the themes of forest fires. But before we get into it, how do we introduce Dr. Rajesh Thadani, apart from the fact that you're a Yale-trained ecologist, currently the chairman of the Himalayas Trust, and a founder of the Center for Ecology Development and Research, where you are a senior fellow? Is there anything else that you would like to add to your introduction that I might have forgotten?
No, that's pretty good, Amol. Thank you. I'm also the chair of NEDA, which works in the Northeast, and also of a college in Bombay, Jain College. But yeah, and most importantly, a field researcher and a forest ecologist.
On the field research and the forest ecology, but I'm going to come a bit later. But thank you for that. Those are important additions to your introduction. Let's jump right into the conversation that we wanted to have around forest fires and ecological disasters. Before I go there, and before I bring up the article that you were kind enough to write for the inaugural issue, and here is the copy of the inaugural issue, Our Forests Are on Fire. You gave a very interesting interview to the Business Standard in 2016. Around the time, Uttarakhand forest fires had started coming into the mainstream news after a very long time. You made two very interesting points. A, that the ground forest fire regime, which is known to the people of Uttarakhand, has changed in a drastic way, perhaps due to climate change. And second, that even though the colonial institution of forest lions has been maintained by the state government and the forest department, the practice itself does not quite do much to alter the change in the forest regime. We are now almost a decade later talking about forest fires again. What do you think has changed in the forest fire regime in the last 10 years?
Among a couple of things have changed, and the most important of these is related to climate change. I think what we are seeing is more variable climate across North India, and especially in the Himalayas. The Himalayas are known to be warming faster than regions around them. More warming, more heat, lower relative humidity. The stage is set for hotter and more frequent fires. More importantly, what we are finding is that the periodicity of rainfall is changing, and that's something that's been fairly noticeable. So while the trends for total rainfall across the year are not very clear when you look at it on a Himalayan scale, what is fairly clear is that rainfall is occurring more frequently and in more intense bursts, and then you have drought periods which are longer, leading to greater drying, greater propensity of forest fires. So one reason and the main reason for increase in forest fires is climate change related reasons. The climate is changing, as we know, globally, and that is leading to more intense forest fires everywhere and in the Himalayas. We are not seeing, as of now, a major change in ground fires becoming crown fires. So ground fires are low-intensity fires that sort of sweep across the ground. That's what's common across the Himalaya. They don't really get into the canopy and burn trees all that often. But in bad fire years, 2016 was a good example of a fairly severe fire year for the Himalaya, but there have been many others as well. Many of these ground fires become crown fires, which means they envelop the crown of the tree and burn the whole tree down and cause extensive damage in the forest. When a crown fire occurs, the forest doesn't recover, it's burned. When a ground fire occurs, as is often seen in pine forests, for example, almost every year. You go back into the same forest after the monsoon a few months later, and you can barely make out the difference. So these are two very different kinds of fires. The ground fire can become a crown fire, but as of now, it's mostly staying as a ground fire. But we do expect the intensity of these to increase. We do expect more of these ground surface fires to become crown canopy fires. The other question which you alluded to, which is a very interesting one on fire lines. Yes, fire lines are still being cut. Yes, the forest department is doing all that it can. But there have been a lot of changes in the way we manage Himalayan forests. Silvicultural operations have been, as you well know, largely banned since 1980s, when the Chipko movement had resulted in the banning of silvicultural management. Now, that was important at that time because our forests were being needlessly cut. There was also there was a lot of human pressure on forests, and forest degradation was occurring as well as forest loss due to silvicultural reasons, due to cutting for timber. 40 years of not cutting has not impacted so much the the local cutting of forests, which still continues, though much less as people become more affluent, as alternatives to fuel wood fodder. The Indian government has done an excellent program in introducing LPG, for example, which is now catching on, which is reducing the need for fuel wood. Which is also meaning that in some places, fallen fuel wood, fallen twigs are not being picked up for fuel wood, as would happen. The complete ban on green felling in the hills has meant a build-up of fuel load. Now, there's been lots of good as a result of this ban on green felling, but one of the issues is that fuel load is building up, which means that the chances of forest fires occurring again or becoming more severe become enhanced. So it's a somewhat long answer to your two short questions, but I hope that responds to it.
No, of course it does. Thank you very much for it. For a lot of people who are going to be listening to it later, because you are the expert in ecology, would you mind explaining the forest line? I asked you the question, but I now think that perhaps the forest line bit, if you just explain what it is, would add to the depth of the discussion.
Yeah, so when a forest is on fire, it spreads more easily uphill than downhill, but it just spreads as fuel is burnt and it moves along, as you know. Now, the one way to stop the fire is to draw fire lines. You basically create a small line. It could be a road, for example, which has no combustible fuel wood. And the hope is that the forest won't jump over this line, won't jump over this area which has no combustible fuel, and burn the rest of the forest. So fire lines at their most basic are just lines of varying width, which are cut through the forest, which prevent the forest fire from jumping across into the rest of the forest. Now, the width of the fire line is a big question. When there are superficial ground fires, a fire line that's only 5 or 10 meters, for example, the width of a road can act as a very good fire line and will prevent the fire from jumping over. But when these fires become crown fires, then, for example, a cheered pine tree starts burning, the cones of the cheer start burning. There are these little explosions of the resin pockets, and you have sparks that fly and that can cross many fire lines. So they can cross the road, for example. But even in those cases, these fire lines will help because they become a sort of fortification that can help you defend against the fire. So if you have some firefighters on the other side of the fire line, any little sparks that are lit, for example, can be extinguished by the firefighters or local villagers or whoever is there to fight the fire. If the canopy fire becomes very intense and you have high winds, as was seen recently in the fires in Los Angeles and in California, then fire lines tend to become largely defunct because the sparks can fly for tens or even hundreds of meters. And just having a fire line doesn't help you very much there. But in most Indian scenarios in the Himalayas, fire lines, which are, just to put it very simply, the width of a broad road, can be very effective in preventing the spread of fire.
Thank you very much for that. So we are now going to take get into the macro aspect of this conversation. And the first thing, and you just mentioned it, the LA forest fires. So one of the things I saw that you referred to was the climate change. But we now have a president in power in the United States. And, his the ideology that has, for lack of a better word, spawned the new Republican movement has also spurred, let me put it like that, pockets of resistance to knowledge in Europe, in Australasia, in parts of Africa, even in parts of Asia. So climate change is expected to create more of these damages. But then how do you create earlier the problem used to be when I was an employee of the Center for Ecology Development and Research and not hardly doing any work under your leadership. The problem used to be, how do you connect the intention and action gap? Now the problem is, forget about the intention and action. The problem is that how do you get the knowledge back into the room instead of whoever and whatever new hot idea that is spurring this conversation that perhaps climate change is not that big a problem. Two things that I would want your opinion, input, ideas on. One, forest fires are decidedly moving up north. You now have a lot more forest fires that are taking place in places that forest fires are not really known for. For example, boreal forests. This movement is a direct result of climate change. This is something that the scientific literature has been very, very clearly has been able to establish this. But why do we not have a policy mechanism around it? So that's my first question. And my second question is a follow-up to this. Is the science and are the scientists missing the bus on communicating the problems and the tragedy of forest fires effectively to the public at large? So, two comments for you.
So, Amog, I'll start with the second one. I'm a big believer in science and knowledge, and again, I have great respect for science that comes from the US. I learned a lot of my forestry in the US, and it's unfortunate that not just the US, but globally, we are finding this movement away from knowledge. Knowledge, open science, I think will lead to a much better world. In many ways. I don't want to get into political discussions or philosophy because neither are my subject. But I think an openness of knowledge and access to knowledge and science is going to be good for almost all aspects of what we talk about globally. When it comes to scientific communication, I think the fact that global warming is likely to occur was talked about not in the last 10 or 20 years, but well over 100 or 200 years ago. Sven Arrhenius talked about the prospects of global warming at a time when only coal was being burnt. But he made it fairly clear that if you're going to release so much carbon dioxide through the burning of coal, it is going to lead to a greenhouse effect, which will lead to global warming. And this was something that again began to be talked about maybe 30 or 40 years ago. And there was a fair bit of attention put into it. There was a lack of understanding and a lack of good science. That at that time it was believed that global warming could actually have some benefits. For example, when you put more carbon dioxide into the air, it should actually help forests because plants, the biggest limiting factor to their growth is the availability of carbon dioxide. When plants open their stomates, when leaves of trees open their stomates, to let in carbon dioxide, they also lose a lot of water, and then water becomes limiting. So carbon dioxide is the sort of ultimate limitation to growth. What people weren't able to work out very well was the impacts that would occur on water, and how plants were very well adapted to what existed, and any kind of perturbation, any kind of change will create a domino effect which people couldn't foresee. And it's only when those climate change impacts started happening that people were able to really understand. And even now, the understanding is not complete on what all climate change can do. These kinds of feedback loops, and fire, I'm going to digress here a little bit, but fire, I think, is a great example of a feedback loop. Because when climate change occurs, it enhances the chances of forest burning. We just talked about the boreal forest, and I'll get to that later. But forests which usually didn't burn will also start burning. The burning of these forests results in the release of large amounts of carbon, which then enhances climate change, which leads to more forest fires, which leads to a greater release in carbon, and so on and so forth. So there's a feedback loop. In fact, there's a major new study from, I think, the University of East Anglia, which has found that carbon dioxide emissions from forest fires have surged about 60% globally since 2001. So from 2001 to 2023, in a little over 20 years, there's been a 60% increase in carbon dioxide emissions from forest fires. And today, forest fires are releasing, I think, some over 5 billion tons of carbon dioxide a year. So it makes forest fires, or the carbon dioxide release from forest fires, as much or more than the carbon dioxide release from the United States of America as a whole. So it's become a very major source of CO2 release, which means it is exacerbating climate change. It is exacerbating the increase of CO2 in the atmosphere, and that will lead to a feedback loop. Your second question on, why haven't we integrated into our policy? I think it's just inconvenient. Eleanor Ostrom had talked about the sort of common property when she talked about common property, for which she had won a Nobel Prize. She talked about res communis and res nullius. True common property lands versus lands that belong to nobody, or resources that belong to nobody. And we've treated our atmosphere, we've treated our oceans a bit like that. You see that with overfishing, for example. We extract fishes from the deep ocean because that area belongs to no one, leading to huge drops in populations of these fish that we like to eat. And then those fish are no longer available. We polluted the atmosphere. We release large amounts of carbon dioxide because we directly won't feel the effects of the carbon dioxide. That CO2 that we release is going to eventually spread across the world. And we say, hey, fine, we can release CO2 over the US or India or anywhere, and that's eventually going to spread over the Pacific Ocean and everywhere else. So the impact of that is going to be much lower for us than it is going to, and the impact will be spread across 5 billion people and across the entire globe. And that is something that still exists, I think, that, it's policymakers across the world say, hey, we need to development requires a higher use of greenhouse gases, of fossil fuels, because that's all we have right now. Alternate energy is still only your solar power, wind power is still relatively minor, and there is still a lot of use of energy, and energy is really what drives our society. And to produce that energy, we are still overwhelmingly dependent on fossil fuels, and most governments don't want to give up that dependence because they feel it will impede growth, it will impede development, it will impede them getting elected in the next election cycle. And that's something that we need to come together for. The Paris Agreement was a good example where we tried to do that, where most countries in the world agreed to try and limit greenhouse gases and limit temperature rise due to climate change to well below 2 degrees centigrade. And that's what it was all about. But to do that, we all had to give up some stuff. We had to spend money to create alternate energy. We had to reduce our high carbon footprints. And that is inconvenient to people, and people don't like to do that. And we're seeing that now in the US since they have withdrawn yet again from the Paris Agreement.
Thank you. This kind of opens up the possibilities for a lot of questions, but I'm going to focus on something that is directly responsible for, or rather is a byproduct of forest fire as well. And you alluded to that as well. The amount of carbon stock that is going up in the air. So, to the people who are going to be listening to it later, and also 6 or 7 people who are listening to us right now, forests are a store of carbon. When forest fires happen, and the reason we are perturbed by the increasing intensity of forest fires, because then the carbon stock goes back up. So what is supposed to take some of the heat away from the global climate change ends up contributing way more to it, and then there is no fallback option. However, in the last 15, 20 years, there have been these arrangements for carbon credits, right? To give you one example of this, not that I need to give it to you, but to further the discussion, UAE has bought a large chunk of forests in Zimbabwe for around $1.5 billion. So whatever UAE does in UAE in terms of putting up more carbon out there, it somehow, this particular stock of forest carbon credits is going to mitigate that. However, this has not really resulted in any significant change in terms of either the economics for the people in Zimbabwe, or largely in the greater scheme of things when it comes to managing our forests better. What are the financial or economic responses that can actually further the intensity of our work around trying to manage forest fire? Because in the article that you wrote for DeCypher, in the conclusion you write that we need a comprehensive plan around it, which also tries to integrate the new economic rationale, which you also attributed to earlier. People are no longer dependent on forest for their everyday needs. So there is something more that they need. But that something more that they need is not coming from forest per se. So how do we actually reimburse people for trying to protect forests? Because the traditional way of doing that has gone out of it, and forest credits and other mechanisms have failed to answer most of these.
So, Amok, I think that's a really interesting question, and especially in the context of India, I think, and I'm going to answer that in the context of India and the Himalaya, because I think it's undergoing a lot of change now. We have traditionally looked at forests as a source of goods. That's where we used to get timber from. It's where we used to get fuel wood from. It's where we get fodder for our cattle. So if you look at Himalayan forests, they're used very extensively as the primary source of energy, fuel wood, as the primary source of fodder for the animals. So people climb up trees, lop them, prune the branches, get the leaves, feed it for their cattle. They're also the primary source of nutrients. So those leaves, when composted, make an excellent quality compost fertilizer, nutrient-rich fertilizer, which is then put into the fields and used to maintain productivity. So there are also a lot of non-timber forest products, medicinal plants, and other things that we get from forests. So we've looked at forests largely as a source of goods so far. And we valued forests for that. The British and imperial forestry, colonial forestry developed around timber. The forests of the Himalaya were valued for the deodar, for the cheer, for the sal that existed there. It was valued largely for the timber, and that's how forest management and silviculture developed. Not to protect the forest, but to find better ways to extract timber from the forest in a sustainable manner. I think that's changing now. If we look at forests, or we look at forested regions, gradually we're going to find that the biggest utility of these regions is not the goods that flow from them, but the services that flow from these forested ecosystems. Ecosystem services, as we call them. So to take one example, I mean, carbon is one example. The storage of carbon is an ecosystem service. So it's not something that's coming from the forest, but it's something that's actually locked up in the forest. And a lot of current afforestation efforts are centered around this theme of locking up more carbon into the forest, which means extracting that carbon or the carbon dioxide from the air, capturing it in a tree trunk, and then locking it up into that forest ecosystem. So there's a great example of a ecosystem service. But we tend to get too focused on just carbon as an ecosystem service. I think there are more important ones we don't, or we haven't found ways as yet to ascribe commercial value to. Water, to me, is the most important. India has a monsoonal climate. Most of our rain falls in those 4 or 5 months of the monsoon, but we need water for all 12 months of the year. We need water for agriculture. We need water in our urban lifestyle. We don't bathe only in the monsoon. We need to bathe all 12 months of the year. We don't cook just in the monsoon. So we need water all 12 months of the year. And to get that water, we've already depleted our groundwater tables quite a bit. We need to ensure that the rivers continue to have water, or have the base flows, as they're called, the dry season flows. To ensure that good base flows occur in rivers, we need to ensure that the mountain aquifers are in good health. And to ensure that the mountain aquifers are in good health, to ensure that water permeates into these mountain aquifers, stays in these mountain aquifers, and are gradually released in the form of springs and streams, which then go on to maintain that minimal base flow in the river, we need to ensure that forest quality is good. Or ensuring that forest quality is good is probably the cheapest way to ensure that our rivers have a good flow of water. So these are the kinds of ecosystem services: carbon, water, and there are many others we can talk about. Protection of the critical infrastructure we have. When we have good forests, the silt flow from the mountains is reduced dramatically, which means the life of our hydroelectric projects is increased, which means we have less damaging floods of the kind that we have seen in the past, where cities' infrastructure gets submerged. So these are all things that forests help in. And these are all things that forests reduce the damage or ensure that our lifestyles can continue. We don't put a price on the water that is flowing through the rivers, but there is a huge price to that. Without that water, our entire system of living would collapse. So those are the things we need to start valuing forests for. And that, as I see, as the future of forest conservation, not just in India, but globally, an increasing value of the kinds of services that the forests help provide, rather than a focus on the goods, because now there are enough alternatives appearing or coming into play when it comes to goods.
Right. So you are talking about essentially making forests an integral part of the economic chain. Now, we are having this conversation in the run-up to the budget, and perhaps this conversation will be released after the budget. When we talk about sort of buzzword funding, not just in India, but across the world, so AI, machine learning, so on and so forth, for the last 4 or 5 years have been the strong buzzwords which can make or break companies, economies, and countries. For example, China releases a cheaper AI model, which does not require the intensive NVIDIA chips, and you have the NVIDIA stock doing a nosedive. But these critical questions around, how do you go and put a value on something which can contribute to the ecosystem services, requires universities, technology centers, research labs to be funded well. Across the world, while preparing for this conversation, I was just trying to understand how is the funding landscape for forest research changing. And there's been a huge downturn. I mean, Marquee institutions like Yale Forestry, your alma mater, is not able to guarantee a job for its PhD, for people who've completed their PhD now from Yale Forestry. Primarily because the focus has completely shifted away. The idea is that we'll be able to find a technological fix for something. How do we get the academia out of the financial pitfall that it has found itself in? And what, according to Dr. Rajesh Thadani, would be the way to get scientific research back on track so that some of the questions about forest fires are not being asked by on a platform like this, but there are multiple conversations happening around the country in forums as diverse as population ecology and community ecology, which seems to have died out a bit.
So, Amog, I think these are a whole bunch of questions and fairly complex ones. I'm going to try and unravel and answer a few of these. For one, I think the way we look at development is a little perverse. So to give an example, and this has been cited by many people many times before, but I think it needs to be repeated, that if we were to preserve a virgin forest, I mean, if we were to preserve the Amazonian rainforest, for example, or some pristine Himalayan forest, sacred groves that haven't been touched, the economic value of those forests is pretty much close to zero, because a GDP calculation just does not take into play the value of the forest that exists. However, if we were to cut down these forests, timber has a value, it adds to our GDP. The people who are cutting those forests, they get employment, that adds to our GDP. We might then convert those lands into agriculture, that adds to our GDP. We might get cattle there, those will add to our GDP. So the moment we cut down the forest, our GDP goes up. But if we keep the forest untouched and pristine, it makes no impact at all to our GDP, which is the main development indicator. And that is because the kinds of things we were just talking about, storage of carbon now at least is being valued a little bit, but that value keeps changing dramatically. So we still haven't figured out what the real values are. But things like flood control, things like provision of water, there is no value put to those, even though we realize that they are absolutely critical. Some 30, 40 years ago, a Bengali scientist had done some valuation of a tree and found that each tree is worth, I don't know, in those days, tens of lakhs of rupees. And he had done that by just trying to figure out what the value of artificially creating oxygen that the tree would otherwise create. That was one of the main components of the value he ascribed to it. And that is a huge value. If all the plants in the world or all the forests in the world suddenly disappeared, the carbon dioxide levels in the air would start dramatically rising, because we take in oxygen and give out carbon dioxide, and the forests and trees are what reverses that whole process. So life as it is not possible without these forests, without natural ecosystems, and yet we don't ascribe any value to these ecosystems. Our main measure of development, which is your GDP increase, just puts zero value to having good forests. So a country like Bhutan, which has 70-80% forest cover, doesn't really get rewarded very much. India has been doing a fair job in this. Over the last 20 years or so, the state finance commissions have been now ascribing a certain value to the forest, and states which have high levels of forest are given an extra incentive. But that process is still remarkably unsophisticated. It is just based on forest cover rather than quality of forest, and it does need to be looked at. Some states, such as Meghalaya, have done a little bit of work in rewarding people or paying people for ecosystem services. But again, going into what you talked about, so I mean that's one part of the question I've answered. The other, I mean, how does one look at these technological fixes, as you say? I think our way of looking at development tends to be rather reactive rather than proactive. So we will deplete forests, and when those forests get depleted, the springs get depleted, the springs that are feeding towns get depleted, and then we say, okay, so now we don't have any, and also the populations of towns would have increased, which also, of course, contributes to this. But we suddenly say that, okay, we don't have any water now in the spring, so let's build an expensive engineering solution. So we go and find some river which has enough water still, and then we build expensive pipelines and lift the water to the town. So a town like Almora would be a great example of that. Almora was known to have hundreds of springs which supplied water to the entire town. Today, not even 1% or 2% of the water of Almora town is supplied by springs. All of it is lifted. To some extent, engineering solutions will be required as we urbanize, as our towns and cities get bigger. We will need some kinds of engineering solutions to support these towns and cities. But it would be far smarter and far more cost-effective if we blended these engineering solutions with nature-based solutions, with ways to tap into ecosystem services, maintain natural ecosystems, and ensure that those natural ecosystems also are supporting cities. We see this in Delhi, where we live. The Aravalis, for example, are a great resource to the city. Not only do they help the water table of the city by ensuring that water infiltrates into the water table, but they're also the green lung of the city. But even now, we see that commercial development is leading to the cutting down of the Aravalis. Even now, state governments will keep opening up land in the Aravalis, allowing for building to take place, allowing for the natural ecosystem function of these mountains, which are only a few percentage of the total area in the NCR, to be depleted further. So, these are things that at some point we really need to understand the value. We need to understand how every Delhiite will lose if these natural lungs are depleted. We need to understand how society as a whole will lose when we deplete these ecosystems, rather than just looking at the small benefits that a small number of people, be it the builder lobby or certain politicians or whoever, will get as a result of this.
Right. So this has been a very interesting and enlightening conversation. Let me ask you the last question and end on a hopeful note. What do you see as is there a silver lining that you see in the changing paradigm of the forest fires? Is there something that the research that CEDAR has done or that you are aware of that kind of posits to some amount of changing perspective or some amount of positive change that we can look forward to in case of forest fires and largely around the forest regimes in the country and also broadly in Asia?
So I'll answer that in two ways. One is talk about a little bit about the science and then talk about people and society as a whole. When we talk about science, I think one of the heartening things has been that the understanding of forest hydrology in the Himalaya has increased dramatically in the last 20 or 30 years. We now understand much better how springs are recharged, how water infiltrates into the ground, how certain critical recharge zones are responsible for a lot of the hydrological benefits that exist from these mountains. The fact that we understand them means that we now have the ability to act on them. As an example, some of the work that CEDAR had done, and a colleague of mine, Dr. Vishal Singh, who you well know, we found that, or it was already known, but we popularized the fact that one little ephemeral lake called Sukhatal was responsible for much of the subsurface flow that occurred in Lake Nainital. Now, once that's out into the public domain, once people understand that, then we can take action to preserve these critical recharge zones, Sukhatal being a good example of that. Similarly, we find across forests that there are certain zones which are more helpful in improving the hydrology of the regions, of ensuring that there is more moisture, and we, once that knowledge is better known, we can act on it. And I think that is one way to help combat forest fires. When it comes to policy, and so I'm going to add a third dimension to it, when it comes to policy, I think our courts have also become more accepting of the fact that certain amounts of forest operations are needed. Fire lines do need to be drawn, and they are now encouraging certain amounts of forestry operations to take place, which might help improve the quality of the forest. And I think that's a positive trend. And finally, and most importantly, when there are many downsides of social media and Facebook and things like that, but I think the fact that forest fires in places like Uttarakhand and all have really entered the public consciousness is also very important. There is now gradually an environmental movement that is growing across India. People are realizing the importance of natural ecosystems. People are realizing the peace and mental well-being they get from being in natural ecosystems, and are more willing to make an effort to protect those ecosystems. And I think eventually, it sounds very political to say so, but we need to have faith in the people of this country, and I think that's what's eventually going to save us. That society as a whole, the common person as a whole, will recognize more the importance of natural ecosystems and will make that effort, will lend her voice or his voice to protecting these ecosystems. And I think that's the best we can hope for right now.
Thank you. It was an enlightening conversation. I learned a lot. And though I would like to point out that my role in the Sukha Tal has been wiped out from history, and my multiple treks to Nainital, 40 kilometer long, I might add, have not been taken into consideration. Walking trips had to.
You were a big part of this bringing into the public consciousness the importance of Sukha Tal. So we thank you for that as well.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Thadani, for taking the time out. And also, we hope to have you in our office at some point of time, where perhaps the forest fire thing that we are working with CEDAR can be explored further, and look forward to your sage comments and wisdom at that point of time. But
Great.
Thank you very much for today.
More interactions. Thanks a lot. Thank you, Amol.